McLaren director Roger Donaldson on the brutal world of motor racing. Bevan Reid, supply director, Roger Donaldson, on telling the story of Bruce McLaren. As extraordinary and extraordinarily tragic as the story of Bruce McLaren's life remains, you have to scratch your head in bewilderment. The risks he and his fellow drivers accepted in the name of sport simply wouldn't stand today, and probably haven't since the time of gladiators. Not even Roger Donaldson, the filmmaker behind the McLaren documentary, released nationwide today, who talked to pretty much everyone who was close to the man, is of great help explaining. Yes, we get that Bruce loved cars and had a passion for racing, but still, what was it that made dicing with death so worthwhile? It certainly wasn't the money. The millionaires of the Formula One circuit are a relatively recent invention. McLaren himself put it this way: to do something well is so worthwhile that to die trying to do it better cannot be foolhardy. It would be a waste of life to do nothing with one's ability, for I feel that life is measured in achievement, not in years alone. McLaren director Roger Donaldson admits he caught the car bug from his father. It's worth noting though that those words come from his eulogy to American McLaren driver Tim Meyer, who died, aged 26, in a crash during a practice lap, so it's perfectly understandable that he sought to give meaning to yet another early demise. It would have been harder in Ange Baldwin's case. He was a marshal at the 1962 Monaco Grand Prix, which McLaren won, and was killed by a tire that came loose in a four-car collision. As his remains were being dealt with, Bruce and wife Patty were dining with Prince Rainier, Grace Kelly, Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton, but them's the breaks. Bruce McLaren and mechanic Wally Wilmot during the New Zealand Grand Prix in 1964. Another Formula One legend, Jackie Stewart, would be one to ask. He famously began installing benches around his rural home, each to remember someone who raced and later died, including far too many who did so doing what he loved. How do you think he felt looking out his window to see a dozen inscribed benches? Then 20. And now 56 and counting. That's not a backyard, that's a cemetery. And good luck trying to find accurate numbers for the total number of car racing deaths. They're all over the place, and many don't include McLaren at all. For his part, Donaldson is clearly in awe of these risk-takers and has been since he caught the car bug from his father. He even got to hear the roar of McLaren racing at Sandown Park during the 1962 Australian Grand Prix Series, even if he was there to support Australia's champion driver, Jack Brabham. McLaren finished third, 2 places ahead of another champion, Englishman Stirling Moss. When Bruce McLaren, died, Denny Hulme was determined to race in his place despite having injuries of his own. It was the now LA-based director's love of motorsport that made Bruno Lawrence's character in his classic movie, Smash Palace, a former race car driver, It even featured a photograph of one of McLaren's cars, and drove him to film the story of sprint racer Burt Munro in the world's fastest Indian. But there is more than sporting endeavour here. The director sees strong similarities between the racers of the 50s and 60s and the fighter pilots of World War II. "My father was a fighter pilot during the war. I couldn't get him to talk about anything really. He talked about the funny stories, but he wouldn't talk about the work of it." The small McLaren team, all then under 30 and including lifetime buddies such as his manager Phil Kerr, were much the same. They never confronted the reality of death. They just moved on, says Donaldson. "What option have you got?" Scott Dixon's crash at the Indy 500 this week is a reminder of just how dangerous motorsport can be. In some cases, the interviews his featured were the first time they had discussed the death of a friend whose influence they've never shaken. The results are raw. Even after all these years their sense of loss remains undiminished, and it's a testimony to the trust Donaldson built with each that they were prepared to be so vulnerable in their pain. What impact that had is impossible to say. Maybe their willingness to discuss such personal details came from them knowing their own days were numbered, says Donaldson, but Kerr died shortly after unburdening himself, as did another Kiwi driving champion, Chris Amon, and McLaren's wife, Patty, who incidentally lost a 4-year case she took against Kerr in 1996 in which the McLaren family testified against her. Transmission Films, YouTube. Roger Donaldson's McLaren is scheduled to open in New Zealand cinemas in June. Maybe it's that while the Grand Prix drivers of their vintage hadn't been to war, they all knew people who had. What better proof would you need that a young man's life could be nasty, brutish and short, so you best get on with it. Regardless, the risks they ran were just as deadly, and as we hear from McLaren's tape recordings which feature throughout the movie, were never far from their thoughts. Those thoughts must persist too, as movie's premiere came in the same week as Scott Dixon's spectacular crash in the Indianapolis 500. As an illustration of how far the game has come, it'd be hard to beat. That crash seemed to go on and on as the car tumbled, flew and disintegrated, only for Dixon to get up and seemingly walk it off. Had he done the same thing during the 50s, 60s or 70s, he would have been dead, pure and simple, and several times over. "T've never had a hope," says Donaldson. Literally in the 60s they didn't wear seatbelts because the cars were basically petrol tanks and you were sitting in the middle of it. If you hit something, it exploded, and the fear was that you would get burned alive, so the drivers preferred to be thrown out, instead of burning up. What he's saying is they weren't looking to avoid an untimely death, they were stating a preference as to how it would happen. The question for Donaldson was how much of this side of racing to show. While sorting through old race footage, he found no shortage of crashes, so much death and destruction, but they were just too graphically horrible to consider using. Not so much then. Now if you're thinking those guys must have partied like heroes in the grand fighter pilot tradition as a coping strategy, Donaldson isn't so sure. And he looked hard. I know there's been some criticism that it's not gritty enough, where's the ladies and stuff like that, but I don't think they had time for any of that. I'm sure there were girlfriends, but they weren't spending their time chasing skirt. Their passion was building race cars and getting them out on the track and then making them work better and go faster, and that's where they spent their effort and time, and I think we've been honest as to who Bruce was and their friendships. Even so, it's easy to imagine getting caught up in the Kiwis against the world esprit de corps of McLaren's team. From the daring do of his near victory after starting a race almost a minute behind the pack, waving and beeping his way back into contention, through to the sudden and silent fact of his death. The image of his bereft friend racing round to cradle his destroyed body and Denny Hulme's implacable reaction are a movie in themselves. How many knew Hume had taken his mate's place in the race despite having badly burned hands from a methanol fire? The tears of his cobber relating how they had to reshape the steering wheel so he could grip it at all, and despite having seen moments like that over and over, Donaldson still finds them hard to watch. This guy had such an enormous impact on these young men, and they had such a great time together. It was the highlight of their life, and they were there through thick and thin, through the disappointments and triumphs, and Bruce even taught, Invercargill mechanic, Wally Wilmot, how to eat with a knife and fork, and what cutlery to use with which course, and so, in the end I think everyone was so affected by what had happened to Bruce and Dennis' determination that it was sort of let's look the other way and pretend his hands are okay. I wasn't getting them to cut to the chase for the more emotional stuff, I just gave them the opportunity to tell their stories, just them and me, no one else. And I got involved in their stories, so I still get a lump in my throat when I see the footage. So yeah, if McLaren is a ripping yarn, seldom has sport seemed so foreign and unnecessarily deadly. McLaren, G, is now screening.